and thank you for checking out the video. So, another Battletech gameplay video while I consider the words of influential people. Once again, I'm going to be critical of Jordan Peterson. And my criticism doesn't necessarily mean that I disagree with him. There are moments when I absolutely do. And for those of you who haven't seen my first video, I am on the autistic spectrum. I love philosophy, I love Battletech, and I love making these videos. These are all part of what are my special interests. And being on the spectrum, my special interests are effectively my obsessions. It was pointed out to me by a friend of mine that I did not always properly articulate or enunciate my words in my last video. This is unfortunately one of the aspects of my being on the spectrum. I always hear it correctly in my head. In this instance, I believe I said qualify when I meant to say quantify, or something to that effect. Hopefully that sounds the correct way. I'm going to have to listen to this and make sure I said it correctly. Anyways, moving on.
If you want your doctrines to have purchase and to continue to speak for those who stack up at the bottom of inevitable hierarchies, then you owe it to yourself to dissociate yourself from the dangerous radicals, because otherwise they invalidate your ideas.
So, that blurb there, I believe it was iterated in the last video, but I felt the need to re-emphasize the fact that you, as an individual, if you believe something, and in your belief, if someone who agrees with you takes it too far, you personally have an obligation to say, no, that is too far, there is a line. Otherwise, you have situations which led to Nazi Germany. You have situations where you are complacent while people are being hurt. You have to make a stand. Whatever it is that you believe it. I believe that was Shepard Book in Firefly. Anyways.
I can tell you some things about negotiating that you might find interesting and useful. The first is you can't negotiate from a position of weakness. So all of you who are going to be developing your careers in the future, you need to understand that if you want to push your career forward, well, first of all, that you do in fact have to push it forward, because if you're competent and silent, you will be ignored. And you know, that's rough, because you might think, well, people should reward you because you're competent, and yes, of course they should, but if you're competent and silent, then you're not a problem. You're just part of the background that's keeping everything functioning. And so if you want to develop your career in terms of promotion, say, and salary, it's like you have to be competent and you have to be strategic.
This is one thing that I just don't understand from many folks. I have heard it over and over and over in my professional life, where folks complain about where they are, what they have, but they're not willing to take the steps to get into a better position to negotiate for more. I'm confused that people don't seem to understand this as well as they should.
And to be strategic, when you negotiate for a new position or for a new salary, you have to be able to say, if you don't give me what I want, then something you don't like will happen to you. And what that means, it's not a physical threat, it's that you have an option. You know, so you have your CV, your resume in order, right? You're educated and competent and desirable to people outside of your immediate job. You're willing to instantly put yourself in the job market and undergo the stress of finding a new position and undergoing interviews and all of that. And you have that all planned out so that when you go talk to the person that you're negotiating with regards to your salary, you're credible.
Being credible in negotiations is crucial, because the moment you sound like you're making things up on the fly, you're not sincere, you lose.
What you need to do with them is to tell them a story that they can tell to their boss to make you not a problem. And a good story is, look, we really need this person because they're hyper competent and they have a better offer. It's like, well, then you're going to win the negotiation. But if you go in there with no power, well, you're going to lose.
There's not a lot in this chunk of the talk that I have any disagreement with. This is all solid information that more people need to know.
So the first thing that you need to know if you're going to negotiate is that you have to be able to say no. And what no means is that you're not going to do it.
If Professor Peterson sounds aggressive in this, it's because you really need to be aggressive through these things. It just... Anyways, this chunk of the talk goes on. Professor Peterson gives a few more examples, and then he starts talking about compelled speech from the government. It's a rather nice segue the way he manages to fit it all in together. The question becomes, are you willing to negotiate your freedoms away?
There isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, their right to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. That's what happens, is that individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. It's like, and you think, well, how much evidence for that do we need? You know, you're looking at 250 million deaths. It's like, isn't that enough? Well, the people that I read who were profound, Viktor Frankl's a good example for beginners. If you want to read about this sort of thing, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl, and also Solzhenitsyn, and a variety of other commentators as well, who really looked into what happened in both in Nazi Germany and in the communist states. Their conclusion was universal, is that the lies of the state, the lies and tyranny of the state, are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual.
Aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. This is why no one wants to ever give up any rights at all. You have gun owners who refuse any legislation to give up their guns. You have the press and others that desperately cling to the First Amendment. We can go on and on and on with controversial examples in our society. This is the reason why I want people to consider that going to the government to have things done is not always appropriate. The government stops where it's supposed to. And where the government stops is where society has to take charge.
It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. Is you falsify your being bit by bit, and you end up where you don't want to be. And that's a bad idea. And if you're interested in that, there's a great book called Ordinary Men. You read that and you won't be the same person afterwards, so I would beware of reading it. But it's a story about these policemen in Germany. So they were middle-aged guys, and they grew up and were socialized before the Nazis came to power. So they were just your typical middle-class policemen. And they were brought into Poland after the Nazis had marched through, and charged with keeping order in the occupied state. And they knew, their commander knew that it was going to be brutal because they were in wartime, and they regard the Jews, for example, as enemies, and so there was going to be a fair bit of rounding up with all of that, with all of what that implied. And the commander told the policemen that they could go home if they wanted to, that they didn't have to participate in this. And then what Ordinary Men does is document their transformation from ordinary policemen, the sort of people that you know, to guys who were taking naked pregnant women out into the middle of fields and shooting them in the back of the head. And it documents one step at a time how an ordinary person turns into someone like that.
That is incredibly powerful. Because we all like to think that we're not capable of that, don't we? We like to think of ourselves as better. But the truth is that that kind of transformation is so insidious that you wouldn't know it had happened until it was way too late.
You think, well, we don't want that sort of thing to happen anymore. Well, then you don't want to be that sort of person. That's how it's fixed. And if you're not going to be that sort of person, then you don't take the first steps. Because the first steps lead you down a pathway that, at least in principle, you don't want to go. So, well, I think part of what makes me combative, say, compared to someone like Haidt, is that I've spent years looking at the worst things there are to look at. And I've learned from that, and I've certainly learned things that I won't do. And one of them is, I won't let the government regulate my speech.
Because that is how all of that starts. Just a little bit at a time. First free speech, then your guns, abortion. Everyone has the right to be themselves. There are a lot of things that I don't like. That doesn't mean that the government gets to make a law against it just because I don't like something. And that same thing that applies to me, I apply to everyone across the board. You don't get to make that determination. The government doesn't get to make that determination. If you don't like it, start a social movement. Keep it out of government. This next clip, the discussion has moved on, and they're now discussing communism versus nationalism. The Soviet Union versus Nazi Germany. They are nearly comparable in the atrocities committed. but Professor Peterson discusses why it's difficult to quantify that statement. Why there's so many people that think that communism, if done correctly, can still work.
It is a mystery, you know. It is a mystery, because it is the case that there is something about the Nazi doctrine that seems to have a visceral impact that the communist doctrine doesn't have. And I said when I opened my remarks tonight that it might be the issue of racial superiority. You know, it's something single that you can put your finger on. Whereas what's happening on the left that's horrifying is murky. It might even be multidimensional. Like maybe there isn't a single radical leftist idea that's murderous like the racial superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of 3, or maybe it's some set of 4 out of 10. Who knows? So, and because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among the communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you know, you think, if you go back to 1914, it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempts to bring about the socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devils, the Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And Nietzsche had done the same thing in his writing. So people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine. But it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, it's like, well, this is why I said what I said at the beginning. Fine. You know, if I don't know exactly how to make the moral distinction, but it's a distinction that has to be made. I think that people who apologize, who say something like, I think that it's virtually, I don't know if it's as reprehensible to say that a given ethnic group should be consigned to the fire and to say that wasn't real communism, but they're damn close. And when I hear someone say that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. And, or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that, that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
A paroxysm. Let's look this up. What is this? P-A-R-A-I. Nope, that's a band. Okay. Meaning. Okay, I completely misspelled that. Paroxysm. So P-A-R-O-X-Y-S-M. Paroxysm. A sudden attack or violent expression of a particular emotion or activity. A paroxysm of weeping. In medicine, a sudden recurrence or attack of a disease, a sudden worsening of symptoms. Nifty. Look at that. Learn something new. Alright.
I just want to be clear that these students were conceding that they don't agree. They share your critique of
They don't share it enough.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make that clear. But so they would more or less agree with what you just said, I think, about it's not okay to say those regimes weren't proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. They still dispute, though, that socialism as an ideology is on par with Nazism. So I just wanted to make that clear.
We could say communism, let's say, we could say, radical leftist ideology. As I said already, there are reasons for the left and the right wing, right? The right wing stands for hierarchy, and the left wing stands for those who are displaced by hierarchy, right? An endless problem. But that doesn't mean, that still leaves it in the camp of the people speaking on behalf of egalitarianism to figure out just what the hell went wrong and to take some responsibility for it. You know, it's no joke. And we see these things play out continually. Still, look at what happened to Venezuela. Here's a fun story. Do you know that it is now illegal for physicians to list starvation as the cause of death for a Venezuelan child in a hospital? That's how they're dealing with the fact of starvation.
I know I'd listened to the podcast before, and at the time I was at work and unable to fact check that bit about Venezuela, and I honestly forgot about it. So let's see here. Venezuela illegal to report starvation. New York Times, December 17th, 2017. Nearly all Venezuelan hospitals report shortages of basic provisions like baby formula. The president refuses to accept international aid, saying that their economic problems are caused by foreign adversaries. Wow. All right. That's I don't know how I forgot to double check that, to look that up. First world problems, people. First world problems.
And so, if you're tilting towards the left and you're temperamentally inclined that way, and half the population is, then you have an ethical problem on your hands, which is, how do you segregate yourself from the radical policies that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? And you can't just say, well, that's not my problem. It's like, well, okay, if it's not your problem now, it certainly might become your problem in the future. So, and I would say it's actually everybody's problem. In the aftermath of the 20th century, it's everybody's problem. So it's complicated. Like, there is a genuine desire. Like, I worked for a socialist party for quite a while when I was a kid, you know, and I saw both sides of it. I saw some very, very admirable people. I was privy, for a variety of chance reasons, to the leadership of the Socialist Party in Canada at the provincial and the national level. I met the people who ran the provinces, some of the provinces, and who ran the party. And a lot of them were really admirable people. Like, they'd spent their whole life, I would say, working on behalf of the working class, you know. So they were genuine labor leaders. And there was also a lot done in Canada on the left that looks like it was actually pretty good. Standard work week, the establishment of pensions, the introduction of our healthcare system, which I would say probably overall works better than the American system, although not at the upper end. And they were working hard on behalf of people who had working class lives. But then I also encountered the sort of low-level activist types, and I didn't have any respect for them at all. I just thought they were peevish and resentful and irritable. And those two things exist in a very uneasy coalition on the West. There's care for the poor and hatred for the successful, and those two things aren't the same at all. And it looks to me like one of the things that really happened when the communist doctrines were brought into play, and it also, by the way, we did the multinational experiment, right? It doesn't matter where you put these policies into play, the same bloody outcome occurred. Didn't matter whether it was Russia or China or Cambodia or Vietnam, or to pick a random African country, or Cuba or Venezuela for that matter. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. And so to me, that's experiment plus replication. Enough. Well, that has to be dealt with, and it's not. And the intellectual left in the West has been absolutely appalling in their silence on the communist catastrophe. Like for my students, a lot of my students really haven't heard about anything that happened in the Soviet Union in any detail until they take my personality class in the second year of university. It's like, well, what the hell? Why are they learning about that in a personality class in the second year of university? That's not, that should be first and foremost in their historical knowledge, what happened in the 20th century. I mean, it was almost fatal what happened, and we still haven't completely recovered from it, right?
Professor Peterson makes an excellent point right here. Excellent, excellent point that everyone needs to remember. Not everyone who disagrees with you is evil. There are people that have opposing views, that have genuinely good intentions. They have fantastic means and methods, and there is something to be learned from them. Remember this, people. Just because someone disagrees with you does not make them evil. This is the one thing that annoys the crap out of me. So many people put these labels on others and demonize them without taking the time to see if there's anything worth learning. Also, not all people, like I said, are bad, but not all ideas are terrible. For example, I firmly and quite strongly believe in the free market. However, I think I said this on my first video, there are things that should not be in the market. Criminals' rehabilitation should not be a market. Healthcare, education, these things should not be. It shouldn't be a consideration. See, this is where those programs come into play, because I just looked up the top 15 healthcare systems in the world, and the vast majority of them, this was done in January of last year. A lot of these things take time to compile. They don't get out there very quickly. What is the first one? Belgium, very small, wealthy country in the middle of Europe. Number 2 is Singapore. I mean, Singapore is also its own kind of city-state thing. And then all of the ones outside of those nations, all the other nations, I'm English not working so well. Alright, so all the other nations outside of those small wealthy city-states, Qatar falls into that category. All the rest of them have some sort of socialist healthcare setup. And you may not like that. You may think that anything socialist is bad. However, there are facts that say that that setup for healthcare is best.
Ready for orders.
And here in the United States, we should mimic those things that are best. We pioneered these things once upon a time, and then we got complacent. And that needs to stop. Anyways, there is one other commentary that I have, and it's about history.
Right, Commander.
And the fact that our books gloss over the heinous things that have been conducted in our past. Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, China, all over frickin' Africa. This is unacceptable. Our children need to know that these things happened, and they need to understand why they happened. They need to understand how to prevent these things from happening again. How to identify the steps that came to make those things possible. Even in America. How many Native Americans were slaughtered by American soldiers? How many? How many tribes have been utterly destroyed? This isn't something to be proud of, but it is something to acknowledge. It's something to make sure that you can go, I see what happened. I will not let another authoritarian government to step up.
Yes.
I will not allow massacres to happen if I can do anything about it. And you start by knowing how these things insinuate themselves into our culture, our lives, our government. Because that's how you stop them. You identify them before the next Hitler or the next Stalin comes to power.
And so we're not, I don't know if you know, do you know what happens if you blast a single hydrogen bomb 100 miles above the United States? Just one. You lose all your electronics. Right, they're all done. Tractors, cars, trains, subways, computers, phones, all of them burn out. And that's it. So we're not done with this yet. And the Korean state, North Korea, as an emblematic representative of the communist catastrophe, and everyone there starves. There's millions of people died 20 years ago. It's not got any better. So it's not like we solved this problem. And there's a deafening silence on the intellectual side of the spectrum with regards to what happened on the egalitarian left. And there's no excuse for it.
I'm not entirely sure everyone knows about the electromagnetic pulse that accompanies a nuclear weapon. A nuclear weapon doesn't even have to do damage to the ground, just an air burst. Anyways, I'm finishing up this mission. And I've got some extra funds coming my way, so hopefully this will be the last one that I do that's got the hissing in the background from the audio. Hopefully I'll be able to get rid of that here soon. I've had to use freeware and my limited skills. Anyways, au revoir. See you next time. Thank you.